The roar of the crowd was deafening, an electric wave of anticipation surging through the packed arena. Fans from all corners of the world had gathered for this moment, their voices blending into a chaotic symphony of cheers, chants, and jeers. The energy was unlike anything seen before, a collision of two titanic forces about to unfold on the grandest stage. In one corner, a warrior known for his relentless wrestling and unshakable discipline, Khabib Nurmagomedov, a man who had never tasted defeat, his aura of invincibility casting a long shadow over the octagon. In the other stood Conor McGregor, a fighter who thrived on pressure, a master of psychological warfare, and a striker with a left hand so lethal it had flattened some of the best in the game. The fight had been brewing for years, a slow burn ignited by words, fueled by rivalries, and destined to explode in a spectacle that would be remembered forever. Long before they stepped into the cage, the tension between these two warriors had reached a boiling point. It wasn't just about competition, it was personal. Insults had been hurled, deep wounds had been opened, and lines had been crossed. For Khabib, this wasn't just another fight, it was about honor, about defending everything he stood for. His calm, stoic demeanor masked the storm that raged beneath, a quiet yet dangerous determination that made him one of the most feared fighters in history. Conor, on the other hand, had built his empire on confidence, on mind games that left his opponents mentally defeated before they even touched gloves. He had an uncanny ability to make the world watch, to turn any fight into an event, and with Khabib, he knew he was stepping into a battle unlike any he had faced before. The buildup had been anything but ordinary. It started with words sharp, calculated, meant to dig deep. Conor had mocked Khabib's fighting style, belittled his accomplishments, and taken jabs that went far beyond the sport. But for all the verbal warfare, Khabib never flinched. He didn't engage in the theatrics. He let his silence speak louder than any insult ever could. The real explosion came when Conor, alongside his entourage, stormed a fighter bus in Brooklyn, smashing windows, throwing objects, and sending shockwaves through the MMA world. It was an act that turned the rivalry into something much bigger, something personal. The moment wasn't just about hyping a fight anymore. It was a declaration of war. As the night of the fight approached, the world waited in anticipation. Fans were divided, arguments raged on social media, and analysts dissected every possible outcome. Would Khabib's suffocating grappling be too much for Conor to handle? Or would Conor's precision striking find the opening needed to shake the undefeated champion? The questions had been asked 1,000 times, but there was only one way to find out. Under the bright lights of the T-Mobile Arena, the two fighters made their way to the octagon, their faces telling two very different stories. Khabib looked as if he had stepped into a battlefield rather than a sporting event, his eyes locked with unshakable focus. Conor, ever the showman, carried an air of confidence, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, his swagger undiminished by the gravity of the moment. The referee's final instructions were given, but there was no handshake, no nod of mutual respect, only a tension so thick it felt like the air itself had frozen in place. The bell rang, and for the first few moments, the world seemed to hold its breath. This was more than just another fight. It was a clash of two ideologies, two styles, two men who had reached the pinnacle of combat sports in entirely different ways. And what happened next would go down in history, not just for what unfolded inside the cage, but for the chaos that would erupt once the fight was over. The moment the fight began, Khabib wasted no time in closing the distance, his relentless pursuit of a takedown as inevitable as the storm that had been brewing between them for months. Conor, light on his feet, attempted to measure the distance, looking for that perfect opening, that one precise strike that had ended so many fights before. But Khabib was unlike any opponent he had faced. There was no hesitation, no sign of intimidation. Within seconds, the Dagestani warrior had latched onto Conor's legs, dragging him toward the mat with a force that sent a wave of anticipation through the roaring crowd. The battle had begun, and it was unfolding exactly where Khabib wanted it. Pinned against the fence, Conor fought to escape, his usual defensive tricks proving ineffective against the suffocating control of his opponent. Every time he shifted, Khabib adjusted, pressing his weight down, methodically working toward a dominant position. This was the nightmare. So many had predicted the inescapable grind of a man who had never lost a round, let alone a fight. But Conor, known for his resilience, refused to go quietly. He smirked, whispered something under his breath, a taunt meant to unnerve the champion. If Khabib heard it, he gave no sign. Instead, he tightened his grip, forcing Conor into deeper waters, making him carry his weight, making every breath feel heavier. As the minutes ticked away, the tension in the arena shifted. It was no longer just about skill, it was about willpower. When the round ended, Conor rose to his feet, shaking out his arms as if to brush off the pressure. His fans erupted in cheers, clinging to the hope that he had survived the worst of it, that his moment would come. But across the cage, Khabib stood calm, unfazed, his expression revealing nothing. And then, just as the second round began, everything changed. A sudden shift in strategy caught the world off guard. Khabib, known for his wrestling, for his relentless ground control, did the unthinkable. He threw a punch, a looping right hand that landed flush on Conor's jaw. The crowd gasped as the Irishman's head snapped back, his legs faltering for the briefest of moments. It wasn't just a strike, it was a statement. Khabib, the fighter so many had labeled one-dimensional, had rocked one of the best strikers in the sport. The shock rippled through the arena, the realization sinking in that this fight was more unpredictable than anyone had imagined. The unexpected twist sent a surge of urgency through Conor. He blinked away the impact, adjusted his stance, and fired back with precision. A left hand found its mark, then another, a reminder that his power was always a threat. But Khabib was undeterred. He pressed forward, cutting off angles, forcing Conor to react instead of dictate the pace. Every second that passed chipped away at the mystique of the Irishman's ability to control fights. The realization was setting in. This was not just about skill anymore. This was about endurance, about surviving an onslaught that showed no signs of slowing down. As the round wore on, Khabib once again closed the distance, dragging Conor to the ground with a force that seemed almost effortless. This time, there was no smirk, no whispered taunt, only the struggle of a man who knew he was trapped. The crowd could feel the momentum shifting, the energy in the arena teetering on the edge of something inevitable. Conor was fighting to stay in the game, but Khabib was fighting for something more. And that's when the most unexpected moment of the night occurred. In the midst of Khabib's relentless attack, with Conor pinned beneath him, a conversation unfolded that few could believe was happening. Khabib, usually reserved, usually silent in his domination, began to speak. His words, caught by the cameras, sent chills through those watching. He wasn't just fighting, he was demanding an answer, forcing his opponent to acknowledge the consequences of everything that had led to this moment. Conor, struggling to defend, replied, but his voice lacked the bravado, the signature arrogance that had defined him. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the one controlling the narrative. The seconds dragged on, the tension reaching unbearable levels. The crowd was no longer just watching a fight, they were witnessing a reckoning. And as Khabib tightened his grip, positioning himself for what seemed like an inevitable finish, the world held its breath, knowing that the true climax was still to come. With each passing second, Khabib's grip tightened, his control suffocating, his dominance undeniable. The tension in the arena reached its peak, thousands of voices blending into an overwhelming wave of sound. Conor, trapped beneath the relentless pressure, struggled to shift his position, to find an escape that simply didn't exist. His arms were locked, his movements restricted, and the weight of Khabib pressing down felt inescapable. Then, in a single decisive motion, Khabib transitioned, securing his forearm under Conor's chin, applying pressure that left no room for resistance. The Irishman's hand hovered for a moment, his pride battling against the inevitable, but the choice was clear: tap or lose consciousness. And then, just like that, it was over. The referee stepped in, separating the fighters, and the realization hit like a shockwave. Khabib had won, not just the fight, but everything that came with it. But what should have been a moment of triumph quickly spiraled into chaos. Khabib, his emotions finally boiling over, stood over his fallen opponent, shouting words that had been buried beneath months of silence. The rage that had been held back for so long erupted in an instant, and before anyone could react, he turned, leapt over the cage, and launched himself into the crowd. The world watched in stunned disbelief as he descended upon Conor's team, a storm of bodies clashing in a frenzy of fists and shouts. Security scrambled, fans gasped, and the once celebratory atmosphere transformed into pure mayhem. Inside the cage, a new battle unfolded. A group of Khabib's teammates stormed the octagon, charging toward Conor, who, still exhausted from the fight, barely had time to react. Blows were thrown, chaos ensued, and for a moment, it seemed as though the night would be remembered not for the fight itself, but for the riot that followed. Officials poured in, separating the fighters, dragging them apart before the situation could spiral further out of control. The energy in the arena had shifted completely from celebration to disbelief, from triumph to anarchy. When order was finally restored, Khabib was escorted out, his victory overshadowed by what had just transpired. The belt, the moment he had fought his entire life for, was never wrapped around his waist in the octagon. Instead, he was rushed to the back, away from the chaos, away from the storm that had erupted in his wake. Conor, still reeling from both the fight and the post-fight madness, walked back to his locker room, his aura of invincibility shattered. The man who once dictated the biggest moments in combat sports had been humbled, not just by defeat, but by the sheer force of something he had never been able to control. The fallout was immediate. Headlines exploded across every major news outlet. Social media erupted with debates, and the sport itself was left in shock. What had started as one of the most anticipated fights in history had ended in a way no one could have predicted. Punishments were handed down, suspensions loomed, and the rivalry, instead of being settled, had only grown more intense. For Khabib, the victory was undeniable, but the aftermath raised new questions. Had he gone too far? Would he face the consequences of letting his emotions take control? And for Conor, the loss was more than just another defeat. It was a turning point. Would he rise again, or had the unstoppable force finally met an immovable wall? Yet, perhaps the most unexpected twist came not in the immediate aftermath, but in what followed in the years ahead. Despite everything, the insults, the brawl, the personal attacks, their paths would cross again, not in the way many expected, but in a way that proved time had the power to change even the most bitter of rivalries. In rare moments, subtle words of respect replaced the venomous ones that once defined their interactions. And while the world continued to debate, to analyze, to wonder what could have been, the two men who had once been at war had, in some way, found a quiet, unspoken understanding. The night of Khabib vs. Conor was more than just a fight. It was a clash of legacies, a battle of ideologies, and a moment in history that transcended the octagon. It was a story of discipline versus bravado, control versus chaos, and ultimately a reminder that in combat sports, as in life, the greatest victories are often shadowed by the weight of what comes after. And though the fight itself had ended, its echoes would be felt forever, ensuring that this rivalry would never truly be forgotten.